Some people smile at you every single morning and mean absolutely none of it. They pour your coffee. They ask about your day. They fold your laundry and leave it at the foot of your bed. And the whole time, underneath all of that warmth, underneath every hug and every sweetheart and every soft look across the dinner table, they are building something. Quietly. Carefully. With paperwork and attorneys and a plan they've been sharpening for years. The terrifying part isn't discovering that someone like that exists. The terrifying part is realizing you've been living inside their plan the entire time, and they never once thought you'd figure it out. My name is Mia Stanton. I grew up in Lewisburg, West Virginia. Population just under 4,000. The kind of town where the same families have sat in the same church pews for 3 generations, where everybody knows your grandmother's maiden name, and where a secret travels faster than a news headline. I turned 18 on a Thursday in March. And by 8:47 the following morning, I was sitting at our kitchen table watching my mother slide a cream-colored envelope across the wood toward me like it was something ordinary. Like it was a birthday card. Like it was nothing. She was smiling. She was always smiling. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that I had been awake since midnight. And by the time that envelope touched my side of the table, everything she had spent 14 months building was already gone. Before I take you inside that kitchen, if this story is already hitting something in your chest, hit subscribe and drop your city in the comments. I read every single one. You'd be surprised how many of us grew up in the same house with different addresses. Let me take you back. Not to that Thursday morning. Further. Back to when I was 9 years old and my father, Robert Stanton, sat me down on the back porch steps of our house on Caldwell Street and told me something I didn't fully understand until I was much older. He said, "Mia, your grandfather built something real. And one day it's going to be yours. Don't ever let anyone tell you it isn't." I remember looking up at him and nodding like I understood. I didn't. I was 9. I was thinking about the fireflies coming up from the grass. But I remembered it. I always remembered it. My grandfather, Edmund Stanton, was not a flashy man. He drove a 10-year-old pickup. He wore the same 3 flannels in rotation from October through April. He had a vegetable garden behind the house that he tended like it was sacred ground, and he drank his coffee black every morning at 5:15 without fail. What nobody outside the family fully understood was that Edmund Stanton had spent 40 years quietly, methodically building a portfolio. Blue-chip stocks. A commercial lot he'd sold in Greenbrier County in the early 90s. Savings bonds going back decades. A man who never once talked about money because he was too busy making sure it was protected. My father died when I was 11. A brain aneurysm. No warning. He was at work on a Tuesday and by Wednesday he was gone. I remember the hospital waiting room had a vending machine with a broken light that flickered every few seconds. I stared at that light for 3 hours while my mother talked to doctors in a hallway I wasn't allowed to enter. My grandfather sat next to me the entire time. He didn't say much. He held my hand. When it was over, when they told us, he walked me to his truck in the parking garage and he said, "You're going to be okay, Mia. I'm going to make sure of it." I believed him then. I still believe him now. My mother remarried 18 months later. His name was Dean Pollard. He owned a small equipment rental company outside of Fairleigh. Big personality, loud laugh, the kind of man who calls everyone buddy, and means none of them. He had a son from his first marriage named Connor, 15, quiet in the sullen way that teenagers perform quiet, and he moved into our house on Caldwell Street like he'd always been there. New furniture in the living room within a month. A new truck in the driveway. Suddenly there were opinions about how the house ran, about what we ate for dinner, about what shows played on the television. My mother bloomed under his attention the way certain plants bloom only when they have something to climb. I watched all of it from the second step of the staircase, which had a clean line of sight to the kitchen and the front door and everything in between. I want to be very specific about something. I did not hate Dean Pollard. I did not even particularly dislike him for a long time. What I noticed was simpler and colder than hate. I noticed that he asked about my grandfather's health at dinner more than seemed natural. I noticed that when my grandfather's name came up, my mother and Dean would share a look, fast, unreadable, a half-second flicker, before one of them changed the subject. I noticed that the word inheritance had started appearing in conversations it had no reason to be in. Slipped in casually. Mentioned and then moved past quickly like someone testing a floorboard to see if it would hold weight. My grandfather noticed too. He never said so directly. That wasn't his way. But the summer I turned 15 he started doing something new. Every Sunday when I came to his house on Seneca Trail for dinner, he would spend 20 minutes after the meal sitting at his kitchen table with me and what I can only describe as a lesson. Not homework. Not formal. Just him talking and me listening. He explained what a trust was. He explained the difference between a will and a trust. He explained what a corporate trustee meant and why it mattered. He drew diagrams on the backs of envelopes. He used words like beneficiary and irrevocable and fiduciary until they stopped sounding foreign and started sounding like vocabulary I actually owned. I was 15. I thought it was a little strange. I didn't say so. I just listened. The summer I was 16, my grandfather's health started sliding. Nothing dramatic at first. He moved slower. He tired faster. By fall it was clear that something deeper was happening. Congestive heart failure, the doctors said. Manageable for now. We'd see how things progressed. He kept the garden going through September. He made his coffee at 5:15. He drove his truck until January when my mother started suggesting very gently, very warmly, that maybe he shouldn't be driving alone anymore. She started going to his appointments. She started organizing his paperwork. She started being very, very present in his daily life in a way she hadn't been before the diagnosis. My grandfather accepted her help with quiet politeness. He also, during this same period, began meeting privately and regularly with an attorney named Clifton Barr whose office was on Washington Street, 2 blocks from the Greenbrier Valley Courthouse. I didn't know about Clifton Barr until my grandfather handed me a sealed envelope on my 17th birthday. We were on his back porch. The garden was already going brown at the edges. He pressed the envelope into my hands and held them for a moment and looked at me with an expression that I have spent the better part of a year trying to find the right word for. It wasn't sad. It wasn't worried. It was something closer to deliberate. Like a man making absolutely certain a door was latched before a storm. He said, "Mia, if anything ever feels wrong with your mother, with Dean, with anything around your future, open this. And call the man on the card inside before you do anything else. Before you say a word to anyone in this house. Promise me." I promised him. He nodded once. He let go of my hands. We went back inside and had pot roast and he told a story about a broken tractor and a neighbor's goat from 1987 and we both laughed until our eyes watered. He died 4 months later. February. The cold kind. I was still 17. The will was read in March. My name was in it. A trust. My grandfather's attorney, Clifton Barr, explained the terms in plain language while my mother sat across the table with her hands folded and her expression careful. The assets, approximately $640,000 in total. Stocks, savings instruments, the proceeds from 2 property sales over the years, were held in trust for me. I could not access principal until my 18th birthday. On that date, full beneficial ownership transferred. My mother was listed as custodial guardian of the trust until that date and nothing beyond it. The trustee of record was Clifton Barr's firm. My mother's expression when Barr read that last part did something I catalogued and filed away without comment. Her smile stayed in place. Her eyes did not. I opened my grandfather's envelope that same night. Alone in my room with the door locked and the house quiet. Inside was a handwritten note and a business card. The note was 4 sentences. It said, "Mia, you are the smartest person in any room you walk into, including this one. I have done everything I can from my end. Clifton knows the rest. Trust him the way I trusted you." I held that note for a long time. Then I looked at the business card. Then I picked up my phone. And I started paying very close attention to everything happening inside the house on Caldwell Street. Dean started coming home later that spring. He blamed the business. Equipment season, he said. Peak rental months. My mother accepted every explanation with a nod and a warm plate kept in the oven. But I noticed that his phone stayed face down on the counter now. That he took calls in the garage with the door pulled shut. That twice in April, a car I didn't recognize sat at the end of our street for 20 minutes before driving away. I noticed all of it. I said nothing about any of it. I was my grandfather's student. I was learning that the most important thing you can do when someone is underestimating you is to let them keep doing it. Let them build their plan in the dark. And when the time comes, turn the lights on. Clifton Barr's office did not look like money. That was the first thing I noticed when I walked in for the first time on a Wednesday in April, 3 weeks after the will reading. The carpet was the color of old moss. The waiting room had 2 chairs and a side table with a lamp that leaned slightly to the left. A framed print of the New River Gorge hung behind the receptionist's desk, the kind you buy at a rest stop gift shop. But the receptionist, a woman named Gloria who looked like she had seen everything twice and found none of it particularly surprising, checked my name off a list without looking up and said, "He's ready for you. Second door on the left." And when I walked into Clifton Barr's actual office, I understood immediately that the waiting room was not an accident. It was a filter. The people worth meeting got past it. Barr was 62. Wire-rimmed glasses. A desk buried under accordion folders and legal pads. A bookshelf running the full length of one wall, every shelf double-stacked, the overflow piled on the floor in neat columns. He stood when I came in, reached across the desk, shook my hand like I was a colleague, not a 17-year-old girl who had just lost her grandfather and didn't fully understand why she was there. He said, "Sit down, Mia. Your grandfather talked about you constantly. I feel like I already know you." I sat. I said, "What did he tell you?" Barr smiled. He said, "He told me you were the kind of person who listens more than she talks and remembers everything she hears." He said that like it was the highest compliment he knew how to give. I thought about that for a second. Then I said, "What did he ask you to do?" Barr opened a folder. He walked me through the existing trust structure piece by piece. He used the same plain language my grandfather had spent 2 years teaching me, which I understood now was not a coincidence. My grandfather had known I would end up in this office. He had been preparing me for this exact conversation since I was 15. The trust as it currently stood was solid but not airtight. My mother's role as custodial guardian gave her certain administrative access until my 18th birthday. Not access to the funds themselves, but access to paperwork, to correspondence, to the kind of information that, in the wrong hands, with the right attorney, could be used to build something dangerous before I was old enough to stop it. Barr said, "Your grandfather was worried about this window. The 14 months between his death and your birthday. He called it the gap." I said, "What can happen in the gap?" Barr looked at me steadily. He said, "Quite a lot if someone is motivated and has legal help." He didn't have to say my mother's name. I didn't ask him to. I said, "Has she contacted you?" He paused one beat, which was its own answer. Then he said, "She called the office twice in the 3 weeks since the reading. Both times she asked about the administrative transfer process. Both times I told her that all correspondence regarding the trust would go through me and would be documented. She hasn't called since." I sat with that for a moment. Twice in 3 weeks. My mother, who had never in my memory shown the slightest interest in legal documents or financial instruments, had called my grandfather's estate attorney twice in 3 weeks asking about process. I said, "She's not asking because she's curious." Barr said, "No, she's not." I drove home from that meeting at the speed limit with both hands on the wheel of my grandfather's old truck, which he had left to me in a separate bequest and which my mother had already twice suggested I sell because the insurance was an unnecessary expense. I pulled into the driveway on Caldwell Street. I sat in the cab for a minute. The house looked exactly like it always had. Same white siding. Same green shutters my grandfather had painted 3 summers ago. Same wind chime my mother had hung on the porch when Dean moved in, which I had always hated and never said so. Everything looked ordinary. That was the thing about a house where something was wrong. It kept looking ordinary right up until it didn't. Over the next 6 weeks I became a student of my own home in a way I had never been before. Not paranoid. Precise. I noticed that my mother had started keeping a zippered portfolio on the kitchen counter that she moved to the bedroom whenever I came into the room. I noticed that Dean had begun referencing my future in ways that were just slightly too casual, too rehearsed, like lines he'd practiced before dinner. He said things like, "Smart money doesn't just sit in a lawyer's hands, you know, and family takes care of family, that's just how real wealth works." And once on a Sunday in May while I was washing dishes, "Your grandfather was a great man but he didn't understand modern financial planning." I kept washing the dishes. I said, I filed it. Connor, Dean's son, was not part of whatever was being built. I was fairly certain of that early on. He was 17, spent most of his time in his room playing video games or at his mother's place across town on weekends. He and I had developed a comfortable enough neutral relationship over the years. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. But one evening in June he came into the kitchen while I was making toast and said without looking at me in the voice of someone delivering a message they'd been carrying for a while and wanted to put down, "My dad's been meeting with some lawyer." Guy named Rutherford. Has an office over in Lewisburg off Court Street. He opened the refrigerator. He took out a soda. He left the kitchen. He did not look at me once. I stood there with my toast and understood that Connor had just done something that cost him something, and that I owed him a debt I would probably never be able to repay out loud. Rutherford. I wrote the name down that night in a notebook I kept inside my pillowcase. I had started the notebook in April. It held dates, names, observations, the kind of documentation that felt excessive when I started it and felt necessary about 2 weeks in. The next afternoon I drove past Court Street on my way home from the library. There was one law office on the block. A sign in the window said Rutherford and Associates, Estate and Family Law. The blinds were half closed. A silver SUV sat in the reserved spot out front. I didn't stop. I drove past. I noted the address. I texted Clifton Barr that evening. I said, "Have you heard of a lawyer named Rutherford on Court Street in Lewisburg?" His reply came 11 minutes later. It said, "Yes." "Where did you hear that name?" I said, "Does it matter?" He said, "Come in Thursday." Thursday. Barr's office. The leaning lamp. Gloria checked me in without looking up. Barr had a new folder on his desk when I came in, and his expression was the particular kind of neutral that experienced people use when they have something difficult to say and want to say it right. He said, "Paul Rutherford has been practicing in Greenbrier County for 22 years. He's competent. He's not unethical on paper. But he has a history of taking on what the Bar Association would call aggressive family estate restructuring cases." I said, "Meaning?" He said, "Meaning he has helped family members reroute assets from direct heirs into joint family structures, holding companies, shared trusts with co-trustees who happen to be the people who hired him. He's never been formally disciplined. He's come close twice." I said, "How long has he been working with Dean?" Barr said, "Based on what I've been able to piece together from public filings, approximately since January." January. My grandfather had been gone since February. Rutherford had been retained the month before he died. I let that land. I didn't say anything for a moment. January meant Dean had not waited for the will reading. Dean had not waited to see what the trust said or what my grandfather had arranged. Dean had hired a lawyer before my grandfather's funeral. Before I had even opened the envelope on my 17th birthday. Before I had called Barr. I said very quietly, "He started before Grandpa was even gone." Barr said nothing. He didn't have to. The folder on his desk said enough. What came next was the part one had not expected. Not the anger. I had prepared for the anger and I knew what to do with it. What I hadn't prepared for was the specific particular grief of understanding that my mother had known. Not suspected. Known. Because Rutherford had been retained in January and my mother's name was on the initial client intake documentation that Barr had obtained through a records request he declined to explain further. Her name. In January. While my grandfather was still alive and still drinking his coffee at 5:15 and still tending his garden and still believing, I have to think, that the woman his son had married was not capable of this specific thing. I sat in that chair in Barr's office and I thought about my grandfather pressing that envelope into my hands on the back porch with the garden going brown at the edges. And I thought he knew. He had known for longer than I had. He just hadn't known how to tell me without destroying something I might have still needed. So he gave me a door instead. And an attorney. And 2 years of Sunday evening lessons about irrevocable trusts and fiduciary duties and the difference between what a document says and what it is designed to do. I said, "What do we do?" Barr said, "We build something they can't touch. Before your birthday. Before they file anything. Before they ask you to sign anything." He pulled a legal pad toward him. He uncapped a pen. He said, "Tell me everything you've noticed since April." I opened my notebook. I set it on his desk. He looked at it. He looked at me. He said, "Your grandfather was right about you." I said, "Let's get to work." The notebook had 17 pages by the time I set it on Clifton Barr's desk that Thursday. 17 pages of dates, times, overheard fragments, behavioral patterns, names, license plates, small details that individually meant nothing and collectively meant everything. Barr read it without speaking for 8 minutes. I counted. He turned each page carefully, the way you handle something that might be evidence, because that is exactly what it was. When he finished he set it down and looked at me over his glasses and said, "Did you tell anyone you were keeping this?" I said, "No." He said, "Good. Don't. He slid it back across the desk. He said, keep adding to it. Date every entry. Time if you can. Don't editorialize, just facts. I said, I know. He said, I know you know. I'm saying it anyway. What Barr laid out for me over the next hour was not complicated in concept. It was only complicated in execution, and the execution required precision and patience and the ability to sit across from my mother at dinner every night and give her absolutely nothing to read on my face. The plan was this. We would build a new trust structure. Irrevocable. A corporate trustee entirely outside my family's reach. Every asset my grandfather had left me moved into it at the stroke of midnight on my 18th birthday, the earliest legally permissible moment, before any document my mother and Dean had been constructing with Rutherford could be presented to me and before I could be pressured into signing anything under the warm weight of birthday pancakes and family obligation. Barr would handle the paperwork on his end. A trust company out of Charleston called Allegheny Fiduciary Services had a clean 30-year record and a relationship with Barr going back 15 years. He trusted them. More importantly, he had already spoken to them about my situation in general terms, and they were prepared to move on my birthday with 24 hours notice. I said, what about my mother's custodial guardian status? Barr said, it terminates at midnight on your 18th birthday by the terms of the original trust. There is nothing she can do to extend it and nothing Rutherford can file to delay it. The window closes the moment you turn 18. I said, and if they try to get me to sign something before then? He said, that is the scenario we are preparing for. If they present you with any document before your birthday, you do not sign it. You do not say you won't sign it. You say you want to read it carefully and you want your attorney to review it first. You say it warmly. You say it like a daughter who just wants to do the right thing. I said, and if they push? He said, they will push. You already know how to handle that. You've been doing it for 14 months. He was right. I had been doing it for 14 months without knowing that was what I was doing. Every dinner. Every casual comment from Dean about family money and smart planning. Every time my mother touched my hand and said something warm about my future in a voice that was performing warmth rather than feeling it. I had been deflecting without deflecting, absorbing without reacting, storing without spending. My grandfather had built that in me not with instructions but with example. He was the quietest man I ever knew. He was also the most prepared. I left Barr's office that Thursday with a draft trust document in a folder inside my backpack and strict instructions to read every page, ask every question and come back the following week with notes. I drove home. My mother was in the kitchen making her Tuesday pot of soup that she always made on Thursdays when she had her church committee meeting in the morning. Dean was at the table with his laptop open and the particular expression he wore when he was looking at something financial, chin slightly forward, eyes slightly narrowed, the look of a man calculating something he believed he was owed. Connor was nowhere visible. I said, smells good, Mom. She turned and smiled and said, chicken and wild rice. Your favorite. It was not my favorite. It had never been my favorite. My favorite was vegetable beef and she had known that since I was 6. I said, perfect. I went upstairs. I read the trust document for 3 hours. There was a detail I had not been fully prepared for and that Barr had not emphasized, perhaps because he thought I already understood it and perhaps because some things are easier to read in a legal document alone in your room at night than to hear out loud across a desk. On page 4 of the draft trust, in the section governing excluded parties, my mother's name was there. Teresa Pollard, formerly Teresa Stanton. Excluded permanently as beneficiary. Excluded permanently as trustee. No access. No authority. No claim. Dean Pollard same. Any entity in which either held financial interest same. I read those paragraphs 3 times. Not because I didn't understand them. Because understanding them and feeling them are different operations and both need time. I had made peace with the idea of protecting myself from my mother months ago. Reading it written down in legal language in a document that would become irrevocable was something else. It was a door closing. I sat with that for a while. Then I turned to page 5. The following weeks had a particular texture. Outwardly, everything on Caldwell Street ran on its normal rhythms. My mother made dinner. Dean came home from work and talked about equipment and contracts and a difficult client in Roncevert. Connor moved through the house like weather present and then not. I finished my junior year. I worked 4 shifts a week at a garden center on Route 60 that I had been working at since I was 16. I watered perennials. I loaded mulch. I gave directions to the annual section to people who always looked slightly surprised that someone my age knew the difference between a determinate and an indeterminate tomato. Grandpa's training. I came home. I made notes in the notebook. I met with Bar twice more before school ended. The first truly alarming thing happened on a Saturday in late June. I came home from a closing shift at the garden center at 7:30 in the evening. The house was quiet in the specific way that means people have stopped talking recently. My mother was on the back porch with a glass of wine and her phone face down on the arm of the chair. Dean was not home. I went to the kitchen to get water and I noticed that the zippered portfolio my mother kept moving out of sight whenever I walked in was sitting open on the counter. Not empty. I could see the edge of a document inside it. Cream paper. A header I could read from where I was standing because the font was large and professional. It said Stanton Family Asset Coordination Agreement. My full legal name, Mia Ruth Stanton, was visible in the subheading. I did not touch it. I did not move toward it. I filled my glass of water. I said through the screen door to my mother on the porch, "Hey Mom. Long shift. I'm going up." She said, "There's leftover soup on the stove." I said, "Thanks." I went upstairs. I sat on my bed. I texted Bar. I said, "They have a draft document." I saw the title and my name. Stanton Family Asset Coordination Agreement. His reply took 4 minutes. It said, "Don't touch it. Don't mention it. Come Monday." Monday, Bar's office. He already had a copy. He had obtained it through a channel he described only as a professional contact who shared his concerns about Rutherford's recent filing patterns. He spread it on the desk between us. 12 pages. My name in 6 places. A signature line dated January 15th of next year, 3 months before my 18th birthday, requiring my mother's co-signature as legal guardian. A provision establishing a joint family holding entity called Stanton Pollard Holdings LLC, formed the previous November with Dean as sole managing member. A clause assigning 40% of my trust's beneficial interest to that entity upon my signature. And buried on page 9, a subclause authorizing ongoing discretionary distributions from my trust principal to cover, and I am quoting directly, reasonable family living expenses as determined by the managing trustee. I read that subclause twice. Then I looked up at Bar. I said, reasonable family living expenses. He said, Dean Pollard's equipment company has been operating at a loss for 11 months. He has a delinquent business loan with a Lewisburg bank. 2 of his largest commercial clients did not renew their contracts this spring. I said, how do you know that? He said, public records. Business filings. I know how to read a county courthouse. I sat back in the chair. I said, so this was never about my mother wanting control of my money. Bar said, it was always about that. It was also about Dean needing it. I thought about the car sitting at the end of our street in April. The calls taken in the garage with the door pulled shut. The way Dean had started looking at me at dinner in the past few months. Not warmly. Appraisingly. Like I was a problem he was close to solving. I said, how much time do we have? Bar said, your birthday is March 14th. Today is June 28th. We have 8.5 months. He picked up his pen. He said, which means we have more than enough. I drove home from that meeting the long way. Through downtown Lewisburg, past the old Carnegie Hall building on Washington Street where they did summer concerts on Friday evenings, past the courthouse where my grandfather's will had been filed and where whatever Rutherford had been building for 11 months was also sitting in a public records drawer. I drove past the garden center on Route 60, closed on Mondays, the parking lot empty, a row of hanging baskets swaying in the warm June air outside the entrance. I pulled onto Caldwell Street. I sat in the truck for a moment. The wind chime on the porch moved in the evening air. I went inside. I set the table for dinner. I smiled when my mother asked about my day, and I started counting down 8.5 months one day at a time. The pressure started in November. Not with documents or attorneys or anything I could point to directly. It started the way all pressure in that house started. Softly, conversationally, dressed up as concern. My mother began mentioning my future the way you mention weather. Casually. Repeatedly. Over dinner, over dishes, in passing at the bottom of the stairs. She said things like, I've been thinking about how complicated it gets for young people who inherit money without the right guidance. And Dean knows someone who lost half a portfolio just because there was no family structure in place. And once, on a Sunday morning in early November while I was eating cereal before church, "Mia, I just want to make sure nobody takes advantage of you when you're out in the world on your own." I said, "That means a lot, Mom." I put my bowl in the sink. I went and got my coat. What changed in November was the timeline. Bar called me on a Tuesday evening, which he had never done before. He always texted first. A phone call without a text meant something had moved. I stepped onto the back porch in the cold and answered on the second ring. He said, "Rutherford filed an advisory petition with the county probate court this afternoon." I said, "What does that mean?" He said, "It means he's trying to establish a formal record that your mother has been acting as your financial advisor in addition to custodial guardian. It's a procedural move. It doesn't have teeth on its own. But it's the kind of thing you file when you're planning to argue later that a minor received independent financial guidance from a family member." I said, "He's building a paper trail." Bar said, "He's trying to." I filed a response this evening. The petition won't go anywhere. But Mia, they're accelerating. They know the birthday window is closing and they're starting to move. I stood on the back porch in the November dark for a moment after we hung up. The yard was the shape of my grandfather's yard in the same season. Same bare tree line. Same cold that comes off the hills around Lewisburg in a way that feels intentional. I thought about Rutherford sitting in his office on Court Street filing paperwork designed to make my mother look like my financial guardian so that anything I signed before March could later be defended as properly advised consent. I thought about Dean at the dinner table calculating. I thought about my mother's hand on my arm and her warm voice asking if I wanted more soup. I went back inside. I finished my cereal. I did not sleep well that night. December arrived and with it a shift in my mother's approach that I had not anticipated and that turned out to be harder to navigate than anything that had come before. She stopped talking about money. Entirely. She stopped the casual references, the dinner table observations, the warm questions about my future. Instead, she became the mother I had wanted her to be for most of my childhood. She made my favorite meal, vegetable beef soup, on a Tuesday in early December without being asked and without comment. She asked about my college application essays with what seemed like genuine interest. She came to my winter choir concert and sat in the third row and cried a little during the last song, which was a thing she had done when I was in 5th grade and not since. She drove me to the mall on a Saturday and bought me a sweater I had pointed at in a window 3 weeks earlier, and I had not mentioned it again, which meant she had remembered on her own. I want to be careful here about what I say and how I say it because this part is the most complicated and the most true. Those weeks in December were the closest my mother and I had been in years. And I genuinely do not know how much of it was real and how much of it was strategy. I suspect even she didn't know. People are capable of loving someone and maneuvering against them at the same time. People are capable of holding both things and believing in both things and not seeing the contradiction because the contradiction is too painful to look at directly. My mother may have loved me in December. She was also still meeting with Rutherford. I know this because I checked the silver SUV in his parking lot on Court Street twice that month and it was there both times. Bar had warned me this might happen. He had said, "There may be a period where she pulls you close." It's not necessarily cynical. It may be that she's scared too. But don't change what you're doing. Don't give her anything she can use. I hadn't understood what he meant when he said it. I understood it in December. I sat across from my mother at dinner and accepted the warmth and gave nothing back that she could fold into a document or present to a probate court as evidence of a trusting, cooperative family financial relationship. I smiled. I said thank you for the soup. I wore the sweater. Christmas came and went. Dean gave me a gift card to a bookstore, which was the most impersonal gift I had ever received from a person who had lived in the same house as me for 4 years, and which told me everything I needed to know about where his head was in December. Connor gave me nothing, which was normal. My mother gave me a necklace that had belonged to my grandmother on her side, gold chain, small pendant, genuinely beautiful, and the giving of it was so loaded with implication and history and things unsaid that I put it on and thanked her and went upstairs and sat on my bed for 20 minutes sorting through what I actually felt about it. I still have the necklace. I do not wear it often. January arrived like a door slamming. The warmth in the house evaporated almost overnight. Dean came home later. His answers at dinner got shorter. My mother's smiles went back to their previous setting, present but manufactured, the kind that live on the surface without reaching anything underneath. And then on a Thursday evening in the second week of January, my mother sat down across from me at the kitchen table after dinner while Dean was in the garage and Connor was out, and she put her folded hands on the table between us and said, in a voice I recognized as her serious voice, the voice she used for school meetings and doctor's appointments and anything that required her to seem more substantial than she felt. Mia, we need to sit down as a family this weekend and talk about some paperwork. It's nothing scary. It's just grown-up things that need to be handled before your birthday. Dean and I want to make sure everything is in order. I looked at her hands on the table. I looked at her face. I said, sure, Mom. What kind of paperwork? She said, just some family financial planning documents. Our attorney put them together. It's all very straightforward. I said, hey, can I see them ahead of time so I can read through them? A small pause. Not long. Half a second. She said, of course. I'll have Dean pull them out this weekend. I said, that would be great. I helped clear the table. I washed the pot. I said goodnight. I went upstairs and texted Bar immediately. His reply came in 6 minutes. It said, they're moving to the presentation phase. Stay exactly as you are. Come in tomorrow. Friday morning, Bar's office. Gloria handed me a cup of tea without being asked, which had never happened before, and which I interpreted as either a gesture of solidarity or an indication that the conversation I was about to have required tea. Bar was already at his desk with 2 folders open when I walked in. He looked up and said, how did she seem? I said, rehearsed. He nodded like that was the answer he expected. He said, Rutherford filed an amended petition on Wednesday. He added a co-trustee designation request. He's asking the court to formally recognize your mother as co-trustee of the existing trust on the basis of her custodial guardian role and her alleged history of financial guidance. I said, can he do that? Bar said he can file it. He can ask. The court is unlikely to grant it on this timeline, but that's not really the point. The point is that he files it, it becomes part of the public record, and if you sign anything in the next 8 weeks that appears to be voluntary family financial coordination, that filing supports the argument that you did so in the context of an established family advisory relationship. I said, he's building a frame. Bar said, he's been building it since January of last year. This is the last piece. I sat back in the chair. Outside on Washington Street, a truck rumbled past. Gloria's phone rang at the front desk and she answered it in a voice designed to make whoever was calling feel immediately at ease. I thought about my grandfather sitting in this same chair doing whatever it was he had done in the years before he got sick to make sure that this moment, this specific moment, would go differently than the one my mother and Dean were constructing. He had spent years setting up a countermove to a move he hadn't yet seen played. That was the kind of man he was. Patient. Exact. Thinking 4 winters ahead while everyone else was looking at the current one. I said, what do we do about the amended petition? Bar said, I file a response today. I'll also contact Allegheny Fiduciary and put them on 48-hour notice starting now. When you're ready to execute, I want to be able to move inside of 2 days. He looked at me. He said, Mia, we are 7 weeks out. Everything is built. Everything is ready. You just need to hold your line for 7 more weeks. I said, I know. He said, how are you doing? It was the first time he had asked me that in 9 months of meetings, and the directness of it caught me off guard enough that I answered honestly. I said, I'm tired. He nodded. He said, I know. Hold the line anyway. The family meeting happened on a Sunday afternoon in the 3rd week of January. My mother had set the dining room table like it was Thanksgiving. Not food, the table was clear, but the good placemats were out, the ones she only used for company, and the overhead light had been dimmed to the warmer setting she used when she wanted a room to feel less like what it was. Dean sat at the head of the table. My mother sat to his left. A manila envelope and a yellow legal pad sat in front of Dean like props he had arranged that morning and practiced looking casual around. Connor was not there. I found out later he had been asked to spend the afternoon at a friend's house. I sat down across from my mother. I folded my hands on the table. I waited. Dean opened the meeting. That was the first tell. My mother always managed the household narrative. She was the one who set agendas, controlled tones, directed conversations toward the conclusions she had already reached before they began. Dean opening this particular meeting meant Rutherford had advised it. It meant the presentation had been scripted in an office on Court Street and assigned to Dean because he was listed as managing member on the LLC paperwork and therefore needed to be the one who introduced it. He cleared his throat. He said, "Mia, your mother and I have been doing a lot of thinking about your future. You're almost 18. That's a big deal. And the money your grandfather left you is a big responsibility for a young person." I nodded. I said, "It is." He said, "We want to help you manage it the right way so it grows and protects you long term. That's all this is." He slid the manila envelope across the table. I picked it up. I opened it. 12 pages, cream paper, the same document I had already read in Barr's office 6 months earlier, with 3 amendments on pages 4, 7, and 11 that Barr had flagged in a Friday email as cosmetic changes designed to make the co-trustee language appear more balanced and the LLC assignment appear more limited than it actually was. I read every page. Not quickly. Not slowly. At the pace of someone reading something for the first time, which was the performance Barr had told me to give. My mother watched my face. I gave her nothing to read on it. Dean watched the legal pad in front of him. At the 4-minute mark he said, "You can ask us anything, Mia. We're family." I said, "I know. Just want to make sure I understand it." My mother said warmly, "Take your time, sweetheart." I turned to page 9. When I finished I set the document down evenly and looked up. I said, "This looks like it gives you and Dean shared trustee authority over the fund." My mother said, "It's a co-trustee structure. It just means family has a seat at the table." I said, "And this part here," I tapped page 5, the Stanton Pollard Holdings reference. "What does that entity do exactly?" Dean said, "It's a family holding structure. Tax efficiency. Our accountant recommended it." I said, "When was it formed?" Dean said, "Last fall sometime. The details are in the footnotes." I said, "The footnotes say November 14th. He said, "Okay, November, yeah." I said, "That was 3 months after my grandfather died." A beat. My mother said, "Mia, the timing is just practical. We needed the structure in place before your birthday." I said, "I understand. I'd like to have Clifton Barr look at it before I sign anything." The temperature in the room dropped 4 degrees in half a second. My mother's expression went through a microsequence I had catalogued before. The brief freeze. The recovery smile. The recalibration to a softer angle. She said, "Honey, Clifton Barr represented your grandfather. He's a lovely man, but he's not your attorney. He doesn't work for you." I said very gently, "He told me he does." Another freeze. Faster recovery this time. She said, "We have our own attorney who can walk you through every line. Paul Rutherford. He's very thorough." I said, "I'm sure he is. I'd still like Clifton to see it, just to make sure I understand everything fully." Dean set down his pen. He said, in the voice people use when they are trying to sound reasonable while feeling the opposite, "Mia, this is a family document. Bringing in outside counsel makes it more complicated than it needs to be." I said, "I know. I'm sorry. I just want to be careful." My mother said, "You can trust us." I looked at her. I said, "I know I can." I smiled. I said, "I'll call Clifton tomorrow and see when he has time. I'm sure it won't take long." I went upstairs after the meeting and sat on the edge of my bed and stared at the wall for a while. Not because I was surprised. I was not surprised. I had known this conversation was coming for 7 months. I was sitting with something different, something quieter and more personal than strategy. I was sitting with the fact that my mother had just told me I could trust her while holding a document that proved I couldn't. And she had said it with the same face she used when she made the vegetable beef soup in December and bought the sweater and sat in the 3rd row at the choir concert. I do not know what to do with that even now. I'm not sure anyone would. The following 4 weeks were the most precise I have ever lived. Every day had the same architecture. I woke up. I went to school. I came home. I had dinner. I went to my room. I texted Barr updates when there were updates to give. I drove to his office twice more, once on a Wednesday in late January and once on a Saturday in mid-February. The Wednesday meeting was procedural. He had filed a formal response to Rutherford's amended petition and the court had declined to advance it on the accelerated timeline Rutherford had requested. I was good. The Saturday meeting was different. Barr handed me a finalized trust document, the real one, the one we had been building since June. 21 pages. My name on the signature line. Below it in italics the trust's name. The Edmund Trust. I had not told Bar what I wanted to name it. He had asked me the same question he apparently always asked, the same one he had described asking every client. He had said, most people name trusts after themselves. What do you want? I had thought about it for less than 10 seconds. I said, the Edmund Trust. He wrote it down. He did not ask why. He did not need to. My grandfather's first name in the header of a legal document that would hold everything he had spent 40 years building and protect it from the exact people he had spent the last years of his life quietly, methodically preparing me to protect it from. I thought that was right. I thought he would have thought so too. The execution was set for midnight on March 14th. Bar on a video call. A representative from Allegheny Fiduciary named Thomas Greer, whom I had spoken to once by phone in February and who had a steady, unhurried way of explaining things that reminded me of my grandfather's Sunday evening lessons. An online notary commissioned in West Virginia. I had practiced signing my legal name Mia Ruth Stanton on notebook paper the week before. Not because I was nervous. Because I wanted it to feel deliberate when I did it. The night before my birthday my mother made pot roast. Her significant occasion meal. The one that came out for Christmas Eve and the first day of school and the evening before anything she had decided was important. Dean carved it. Connor ate in silence and asked to be excused early. My mother lit 2 candles on the table and said over dinner, "Tomorrow's a big day, Mia. We're so proud of you." Dean said, 18 years old. Time flies. He lifted his glass in my direction. I lifted mine back. I said, "Thank you both." My mother said, "We'll have a proper celebration this weekend. Maybe invite a few people." I said, "That sounds really nice." She reached across the corner of the table and squeezed my hand. She said, "Everything's going to work out perfectly." I squeezed her hand back. I said, "I think so too, Mom." I went upstairs at 9. I showered. I put on the clothes I had laid out that afternoon. Not pajamas. My good jeans and the cream-colored cardigan my grandfather had given me for Christmas the year I turned 16, the one I had kept in the back of the closet since he died because wearing it felt like spending something I wanted to save. I took it out of the closet. I put it on. I sat at my desk. I opened my laptop. At 11:51, Bar's face appeared on the screen. White hair, reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, the green desk lamp warm behind him. He said, "Good evening, Mia." I said, "Good evening." Thomas Greer joined at 11:54, steady and unhurried as advertised. The notary joined at 11:57, ran the ID check, camera on, everything in order. At 11:59 Bar said, "Ready?" I said, "Yes." I had been ready for 8.5 months. The clock on my laptop read 11 hours 59 minutes and 43 seconds. Then 11 hours 59 minutes and 55 seconds. At exactly midnight I typed my name. Mia Ruth Stanton. Each letter with intention. The notary confirmed. Thomas Greer confirmed. Bar watched the screen without speaking. At 12:02 the asset transfer authorization prompt appeared. I clicked approve. The 2-factor code went through in under 10 seconds. At 12:04 Thomas Greer said, "Transfer confirmed. Funds received. $641,218. The Edmund Trust is fully funded. Irrevocable." Bar looked into the camera. He said, "Happy birthday, Mia." I let out a breath I had been holding for almost a minute. I said, "Thank you." He said, "Sleep well. I'll call at 9. The 3 of them dropped off. The screen went dark and quiet. Downstairs, the house on Caldwell Street hummed the way houses hum at midnight. The refrigerator, the furnace, ordinary sounds from a structure that did not yet know what had just happened inside it. I closed the laptop. I sat in my grandfather's cardigan in the quiet for a moment. Then I lay down. And for the first time in 8.5 months, I slept without counting anything. Bar called at exactly 9 the next morning. I was already dressed. I had been awake since 7, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee I had made before anyone else in the house was up, watching the March light come in through the window above the sink the way it always came in that time of year, pale and thin and not quite warm yet but trying. My mother came downstairs at 8:45 in her robe. She smiled when she saw me. She said, "Happy birthday, sweetheart." She hugged me from behind, both arms around my shoulders, her chin briefly on the top of my head the way she used to do when I was small. I said, "Thank you, Mom." Dean came down at 8:58. He said, "Happy 18, kid," and poured himself coffee without making eye contact. Connor came down at 9 and said, "Happy birthday, Mia," in a voice that sounded genuine, which I appreciated more than I could say out loud. Then my phone buzzed on the table face up. The screen said Clifton Bar. The time said 9 a.m. My mother saw the name. Something moved behind her eyes, fast and controlled the way a fish moves under ice. She said, "Oh, is that someone calling to wish you a happy birthday?" I said, "It is." I picked up the phone. I looked at her. I said, "Do you mind if I put him on speaker? He's been so helpful with everything. I'd like you to hear what he has to say." She said, "Of course." Her voice was perfectly even. Her hands were wrapped around her coffee mug and her knuckles were white. I hit the green button. I set the phone on the table between us. I said, "Mr. Barr, you're on speaker. I'm at the kitchen table with my mother, Dean, and Connor." His voice filled the kitchen, calm and unhurried, the same voice that had walked me through 21 pages of trust documents and 9 months of careful preparation. He said, "Good morning, Mia. Happy birthday. I hope I'm not interrupting breakfast." My mother said pleasantly, "Not at all. We were just getting started." I said, "Mr. Barr had something he wanted to confirm this morning." Barr said, "I did. Mia, for the record, I'm calling to confirm that the asset transfer we arranged completed successfully at 12:04 this morning. The Edmund Trust is fully funded and fully executed. Allegheny Fiduciary Services is the corporate trustee of record. The transaction is legally irrevocable as of midnight." The kitchen went the particular kind of quiet that has weight to it. Dean set his coffee mug down. It made a small sound on the counter. My mother did not move. Connor looked from the phone to my mother and back. Barr continued, his voice steady as a hand on a railing. "Total funded amount, $641,218. Your first distribution request for fall tuition at West Virginia University has been pre-approved. Everything is in order." Dean said, "What trust?" It was not a question. It came out flat and airless. Barr said, "The Edmund Trust, Mr. Pollard. Named for Mia's grandfather, Edmund Stanton. Established last night at the earliest legally permissible moment following Mia's 18th birthday." My mother found her voice. It came out smaller than usual. She said, "Mia, you didn't." I said, "Mom, I did." She looked at me across the table. Not with anger, not yet. With something that looked more like the expression of a person who has just understood that a door they believed was open has been closed for much longer than they realized. Dean said, "You had no right." I said, "Dean, it was my grandfather's money. It was always mine. Having the right to protect it was the only right that was ever in question." Barr said from the speaker, "Mr. Pollard, I'd encourage some care about what's said on an open line." Dean's jaw tightened. He did not continue. My mother set her mug down. She said, "How long?" I said, "Since April." She said, "You've been meeting with him since April." It was not a question either. I said, "He was Grandpa's attorney for 30 years. Grandpa left me his card. I called him." She looked down at the table. She said, "I see." There was a long pause. Outside, a car passed on Caldwell Street. Somewhere upstairs, a pipe ticked in the wall. Barr said, "There's one more thing I'd like to put on the record while we're all together." I said, "Go ahead." He said, "I want to note for documentation purposes that the document titled Stanton Family Asset Coordination Agreement, prepared by Rutherford and Associates and presented to Mia within the last 60 days, is unenforceable as of midnight last night. The assets it was designed to direct are now held irrevocably by the Edmund Trust and cannot be accessed, assigned or redirected by any third party. Additionally, I filed a formal complaint with the West Virginia State Bar on Monday of this week regarding the preparation of that document. Specifically, the signature line was dated January 15th of this year, nearly 2 months before Mia's 18th birthday, which would have required her mother's co-signature under guardian authority while Mia was still a minor. The bar has opened a preliminary review. The silence that followed was the kind you could press your hand into. Dean stood up from the counter. He said, "You filed on Rutherford." Barr said, "I filed on Monday." Mr. Rutherford was notified yesterday afternoon. Dean looked at my mother. My mother did not look back at him. She was looking at the phone on the table as if the phone itself had done something to her. I said, "Mom, I want to ask you something." She looked up. I said, "Did you know what the document was designed to do? Not what Rutherford told you it did. What it actually did." She was quiet for a moment. A long one. Then she said, "Yes." Just that. One word. No deflection, no reframe, no charity committee smile. Just yes. I nodded. I said, "Okay." Connor, from his spot by the refrigerator, said very quietly, "I didn't know any of this." I looked at him. I said, "I know, Connor. You're not part of this." He nodded once and looked at the floor. Dean said, "We did this for the family. That money sitting in some lawyer's vault helps nobody." I looked at him. I said, "Dean, my grandfather didn't build that for 40 years so that it could cover a delinquent equipment loan." I said it the way you say a true thing. Without heat. Without performance. His face went the color of old brick. A vein at his temple pressed against the skin. He said, "You don't know anything about my business." I said, "I know what public records say. Bar taught me how to read them." He had nothing after that. Bar said, "Mia, your aunt is parked outside. She called me 20 minutes ago." I looked toward the front window. Through the sheer curtain I could see a dark blue sedan at the curb, engine running. My father's sister Ruth, who lived 40 minutes away in Lewisburg proper and who had called me 3 weeks earlier and said in the direct way she said everything, "Mia, when it's done, you call me and I'll be there." I had called her at 12:05 that morning. She had said, "I'll be there at 9. I stood up from the table. I picked up my phone. I said, "Mr. Barr, thank you." He said, "You're welcome, Mia. I'll send the executed documents to your email this afternoon." I said, "I'll look for them." He said, "Enjoy your birthday." He ended the call. Carried my cup to the sink. I rinsed it. I put on my jacket from the hook by the door. I picked up the bag I had packed the night before and left at the bottom of the stairs. I walked back through the kitchen. My mother was still at the table. Dean had moved to the doorway of the living room and was looking at nothing in particular. Connor was exactly where he had been, by the refrigerator, hands in his pockets. I stopped at the edge of the kitchen. I said, "Connor, you told me about Rutherford in June. You didn't have to do that." "I haven't forgotten it." He looked up. He nodded. I said, "Thank you." I looked at my mother. I said, "Mom, I don't have anything cruel to say to you. I also don't have anything that's going to feel kind right now, and I won't pretend otherwise. When you're ready to have a real conversation, an honest one with someone neutral in the room, I'll be there for it." She said, "Mia." I said, "I know." I walked down the hall. I opened the front door. The March air was cold and clean and smelled like the hills coming back to life after a long winter. Aunt Ruth's sedan sat at the curb with the heater running. I walked down the driveway. I did not look back at the house on Caldwell Street, not at the green shutters my grandfather had painted, not at the wind chime my mother had hung. I got in the car. Ruth looked at me. She said, "Done." I said, "Done." He put the car in drive. We went. If this story made you feel something, don't just scroll away. There are so many stories out there that never get told, and here on Confire Stories we bring them to life. So if you enjoy emotional real-life drama like this, take a second to subscribe and be part of the journey. And if you've ever been in a situation like this, or have a story of your own, share it in the comments. I read them. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.